Hi there, hello. As you know, I'm Daniel Kirsch, and today we're going to be discussing again the presidency. And in specific, we're going to be talking about that aspect of the presidency that everybody thinks they know a lot about, but very few people actually do. And that is, of course, the presidential selection process. Now, if this is not entirely clear on the board behind me, I apologize. We'll be going through each and every point so you'll be able to use this for reference later. The first thing I want to mention is that I don't intend this to be a comprehensive substitute for the textbook, but rather a complement. And I want you to think of this, especially for your paper, but also for class participation, more as a research guide than as a lecture, and rather than a definitive lecture, that is, on the important facts that you need to know. So in that spirit, I've listed here the kind of 4 consequential presidential elections that I expect you to know about. I think you should be expected to know backwards and forwards in terms of the presidency and how it's evolved in terms of the nomination process. So to start off, we have 1824, and of course the Crawford selection by the caucus system. And I won't elaborate on these things, but I want you to be able to kind of recall them and explain them yourself during class. Not during class, but like during the class discussion, the discussion board. As well as to be able to make them fit into your papers rather seamlessly. So in 1824, you should know 1912 and basically the finer aspects of Teddy Roosevelt's candidacy in terms of the primary system, how he was able to form a new party as a result of his basically being cheated out of the presidential election of 1912. But then in the long term, ultimately that was not as successful as, the primaries were not that successful as a system until 1968. And kind of being blunt about this, but the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy demonstrated the importance of the primary system in terms of an independent candidacy that is popular. It's going to be very effective during the presidential nomination process in the modern era. But unfortunately, after his death, we have a party that is struggling, the Democratic Party, to find a standard bearer. They end up choosing someone who agrees not at all with Kennedy on the fundamental issues of the campaign. And that is the Vietnam War. He agrees not at all with, I should say, the base of the Democratic Party at the time, which was so anti-war. They had 2 anti-war candidates leading, with the vast majority of votes going to Robert F. Kennedy. And Eugene McCarthy had been kind of defeated during the primary process by Kennedy, but he simply wasn't able to come back after the assassination. And so Hubert Humphrey, vice president at the time, longtime senator, and had been from Minnesota, had become the epicenter of a lot of criticism of the nomination process, and was one of the reasons why the 1968 campaign was so fraught with violence, and particularly the 1968 Democratic Convention. Where he was nominated there after having not competed at all in the primary process. So as soon as they reformed the process, which was very soon after the Democrats' election loss in 1968, the voters had more of a say in the nomination process. But they kept the idea of some delegates being able to vote their free will once they got to the convention. And in 2016, it seemed to matter quite a bit more as the superdelegates loomed very large in the Democratic Party's process, and also 2008, but definitely 2016 as well. Superdelegates are just those delegates who can attend the Democratic National Convention and vote for the party's nominee, not having been sent there as a delegate for any particular one candidate. They're simply there because they are usually retired or distinguished public officials, meaning they're former members of Congress or current members of Congress in some cases, governors and state officials and retired people of that kind. So all of those things should, show you what the significance of the development of the party process is, as well as the party nomination process is. And what happened in 2016 was significant whether or not you agree with who was nominated. I think that'll become clear with some of the other key terms I put up here with the example using the 2016 campaign. So the 2016 campaign is so attractive because it was wide open on both sides. The Democrats and Republicans, neither one had a clear winner going in or even halfway through. There was not an established candidate that was inevitably going to take the nomination in either case. There was no incumbent. Joe Biden was the closest thing to a kind of vice presidential possibility running for president in 2016, but he did not that year. And Hillary Clinton was seen to be the kind of party establishment candidate by Democrats to carry on the Obama administration's policies. And she was also a very established name in her own right, of course. And Jeb Bush, who is, I believe, the older brother of George W. Bush, had raised $100 million in advance of the first primary, which is far and away the largest total I can remember in recent memory of a presidential candidate who was not the incumbent running for the nomination in the year before the nominating contest began. So Bush seemed to be the prohibitive favorite in what's called the invisible primary. That's raising money. But in 2016, more than money mattered. Media mattered. Media mattered in the sense that not only of the ads the candidate could run, but the free media, the kind of publicity that a candidate would receive from the news media. And the publicity that there's definitely a lot of studies out there, but I'll send you one that I believe Media Matters conducted. Yeah, I said Media Matters, but Media Matters is what I'm saying here. It was simply counting the minutes in 2015, the year before the nomination process began. It was counting the minutes in 2016 of evening newscasts, NBC, CBS, and ABC, the major networks, focused on any one presidential campaign. And Donald Trump received exponentially more coverage than any other presidential campaign. And part of that was at least the beginning of a fascination with his sort of celebrity status. And the fact that he was running for president, and also the fact they didn't think it would affect anything else, because they ultimately believed he was not a serious candidate. He hadn't raised any money. He had never had public office before. He had never been elected to anything. And everything he was saying was so far beyond the traditional scope of political rhetoric, they didn't think it would catch on in any meaningful way. And so those predictions, that analysis by really the entire news media establishment did not bear fruit. And in fact, after the initial primaries began, it became very clear that Trump was the prohibitive favorite in Iowa and New Hampshire and the rest of the states. However, Hillary Clinton had a very long, drawn-out battle with Bernie Sanders for the nomination. And she ended up winning this time, and it was certainly closer than she expected it to be, but it was roughly as close as it was in 2008 as well. When she ran against Barack Obama, and ultimately, she didn't win that race, but this time she was able to win. And Bernie Sanders, I think, similarly to Trump in at least one respect, is he wasn't taken seriously at the beginning. He declared his candidacy in March, I believe, in Washington or in Vermont, his home state, one or the other, in front of a few reporters. There was a few network reporters there, but that was about it. And of course, his own supporters, a few of them as well. But then his campaign really caught on, especially with younger generations. I would say Generation X and millennial voters ended up really turning out for him in the first several states. He ended up winning the New Hampshire primary, and he very, very narrowly lost Iowa to Hillary Clinton. But the fact that she didn't, he very narrowly lost Iowa to Hillary Clinton. But she didn't beat him by 50 points. She beat him by 2 or 3 points. I think that really caught people's attention. And so the invisible primary I want to talk about first is the time that money and media matters before any of the initial contests take place. And that ends up really determining what is called viability. And viability really has two definitions. They're both the same. They're both of the same type. The overall word is just how strong is your campaign? How viable is it? And how much do you think you'll be able to compete in the election? And the other is a very technical definition of the Iowa caucus. I want you to look it up whether your candidate will make it to the second round of the caucus, even though you may be a voter that turned out there in order to vote for a specific candidate. If you don't meet a certain percentage threshold, they're not going to be able to make it to the second round, so they won't get any delegates, any votes. But that's probably something to be clarified in class discussion, even over the discussion thread. Certainly not in your book, but certainly in your book, I'm sorry. And horse race coverage also is something to be aware of as well. So let me go into that in a second. But in terms of viability, you should see how an Iowa caucus works, and I will go ahead and link to a particular Iowa caucus from, I believe, 2008 that really illustrates how the process is supposed to work, at least on the Democratic side. It's very different on the Republican side. Horse race stories, okay, even though this is not a great transition. Horse race coverage is something that you should know the definition of. It's simply, what the media does. They cover who's up and who's down, who's ahead in the horse race and who's behind. And the reason I'm able to recall a lot of the kind of campaign anecdotes here that I often teach with, and some of you might also be, is because so much of it is personality driven, and the media really exacerbates that. But to illustrate how it's not always personality driven, or at least what the consequences of that can be, I have a few statistics I want to bring up to you that I think will be interesting to explore, especially in the case of Iowa and the case of New Hampshire. Now, the horse race coverage is especially prevalent in those two states because it's all we talk about for the year leading up to the Iowa caucus. It's who's leading in Iowa, who's leading in New Hampshire. And one question I think is a fair question for an essay, certainly, is why do we have Iowa and New Hampshire go first? And I don't think I need to say more than that. I think your book talks quite a bit about it. I don't expect you to bring in outside resources. But the prospects may be for reforming Iowa and New Hampshire and making them not first, or making them just another state in the rotation of who goes first, is worth talking about as well. And during Super Tuesday, there are several types of primaries, and the three that I need you to know the most are the caucus, the open primary, and the closed primary. Those are the three main types of primaries. A caucus is not an election properly, sort of like a survey, but it's a self-selecting survey. And as people go to a series of high school gyms, for example, and other meeting spaces like town halls and even churches throughout a state, and instead of voting, they go to cast their support in public for people. So there's no secret ballot in a caucus. It sounds a lot more like what voting actually used to be. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. But in Iowa, there's this footage that I alluded to earlier that I'm going to link to. Footage is just going to show you how hand-to-hand it is, how much retail campaigning, person-to-person campaigning is involved in Iowa campaigning. Salesmanship, really, is what it is. And if you're an Obama person in 2008, or you're a Clinton person, or you're a Sanders person in 2016, you go and you pledge your support, and you literally stand with other people who also support that candidate and try to get as many people in the high school gym to your corner of the room as possible. And if you don't get as many people as possible, or enough people make it to the second round, you're considered not viable. And so then all you need to do is go towards some other camp for the second round, and that's how the Iowa caucus works. They recount you in the second round. Now, with New Hampshire and the Republican Party, it's exactly the opposite. There's no retail campaigning. It's just you go. I'm sorry, not with New Hampshire, just with the Iowa caucus in the Republican Party, it's exactly the opposite. There's no retail campaigning, at least in the event. And the caucus was really established by the Democratic Party. The Republicans basically just answered it with holding their own caucus, and they go. And when you see the two sides, it's very interesting. And there's a lot of not conclusions, but maybe speculations you can draw on the personalities that are reflected in the kinds of supporters that go to Republican and Democratic Party functions. So the Republicans sit down in chairs in rows, and they have speakers. They have a podium, they have speakers, and they basically write down on a piece of paper who they support, and they pass it to the end of the row. And they're collected and tabulated in the front, and the results are read. Easy peasy. So it's very different. And I think that may be emblematic of a lot of other aspects of tendencies and organizational proclivities in the parties. So, in terms of Super Tuesday, there were a lot of different kinds of caucuses and primaries that are held. One of them is the open primary. And the open primary is just where anyone can vote, regardless of a party for a party's nominee. And a closed primary is just the opposite. It's where a closed electorate, basically only party members can vote. And in New York, it's so closed that in the primary that, for example, in 2016, you would have had to register as a Democrat by something like October 1st, 2015, to be able to vote in 2016, 6 months before. And so that's the party rules. And so in that state, even though Senator Sanders was winning independents and first-time voters and younger voters, 3 of those sectors were basically closed out of the 2016 election in New York. So it should come as no surprise that Clinton won that state by 57-43, even though Sanders and she were neck and neck in the national polls and in the New York polls. So it's not in those cases. So in those cases, rules matter because you're not measuring apples to apples, really. You're measuring, how one can compete in the shifting sands of the presidential election rules, and further, how you can shift those sands yourself, and your campaign can. So the thing is, you should know the difference, again, between the Democratic and the Republican parties in terms of how they collect support, in terms of their party nominations. The unit rule is the rule that all of the parties' votes go basically toward, all the parties' state votes. As long as you win the most votes in that party's primary, all your votes go to one candidate, kind of like the Electoral College. So if one party votes, if one votes go. So that's how it works on the Republican side. Proportional allocation is what Democrats do, and that really started after 1968. And that's where when a party primary is held, as long as you receive something like 15% of the vote, then proportionally the percentage that you earn in that state goes toward the total vote for that in your total delegate vote for that candidate from your state. So for example, in a fictional state, and if it was a candidate A and candidate B race, candidate A gets 55% of the vote and candidate B gets 45% of the vote, then there are, say there's 50 delegate votes in the state, a candidate would get 27 of those votes and candidate B would get 23 of those votes. So that's how it works. That's kind of how proportional allocation works. So in some ways, it becomes much harder to rack up a high vote total against your opponent than it is in the Republican Party, where they have a lot of unit rule states. Not all of them. A lot of them are proportional, but they have more unit rule states, certainly. And it becomes kind of easy after you win a few big states to rack up high vote totals that are prohibitive against other people competing against you. And those high vote totals are different in both parties. They have different ways of counting their delegates in both parties, and different vote totals entirely. Whereas the vote totals in the Electoral College, everyone knows. That's 538 votes. You need 270 to win. In the Democratic Party, for the nomination, there are roughly 4,000 votes for the nomination among delegates. In the Republican Party, there are 2,000 votes. So in the Republican Party, you need something like 1,100 votes to win 1,100 delegates. In the Democratic Party, you need something like 2,100 votes to win. But those are just formal differences. They aren't substantive differences, really. Or at least it's just a matter of how many people get to attend the convention. But it's also kind of how the math adds up. It's not as if there are more people in one party or another because of the number of delegates they elect. So that's that's what you're after in a party primary is delegates. And if you can win the most delegates before getting to the convention and kind of run up those vote totals to a point where your candidate can't win, any opposing candidate can't win, then you want to be able to declare victory well before the party nomination convention. And that's usually able to happen. The media is always speculating about a delegate fight, but that almost never happens. It didn't happen in 2016 or 2020, despite the fact they seem to think that there would be one in the Democratic Party if Sanders didn't win. Or if, in either case, if Clinton didn't win or Clinton and Obama had to close, had too close of a vote total, and one of them refused to concede. Now to shift gears a little bit, besides the delegate count, which you do need to know, and the formal designations in terms of campaigning, let's see. In terms of campaigning, you need to be able to run ads and form coalitions and craft your own message. So you need money for all those things. A lot of that money comes from political action committees or PACs. And in the past, it's really any organization, whether it's a political party or an employer or a labor union or an environmental interest group or any other kind of interest group, they can form what's called a PAC, a political action committee. And the numbers I can't recall right now, but they're definitely in your book. Any one individual can only contribute something like $5,000 or possibly $10,000 in an election cycle to any one political action committee. But they can spend money on behalf of a lot of different campaigns, and they can funnel money to a lot of different campaigns, meaning the PAC can then donate to other PACs or donate to other party committees. It's basically just this sort of vehicle for money to get into politics in a way that seems prohibitive because all these other rules that used to exist. And those rules, when I say used to exist, meaning they existed for about 40 years from the time right after Watergate until about 10 years ago. And about 10 years ago, the Supreme Court pretty definitively equated the spending of money in the process of a political campaign to the very fundamental right of freedom of speech. And so they had hinted about this for some length of time, almost that same 40-year period. They danced around it. They had declared various aspects of the Federal Election Campaign Act, the FECA, constitutional and allowed, which introduced some federal matching funds and public funds into the election process. But the Bipartisan Campaign Finance Reform Act, sponsored by Senators John McCain and Russ Feingold at the time, they were meant to be something of a limit on the amount of money that can permeate into presidential campaigns and into any campaign, any federal election campaigns, because they saw that Watergate was a scandal that shouldn't have existed. Were it not the need for all of this money to flow into presidential campaigns to keep them competitive, which really doesn't exist anywhere else in the world at the same level as it does in the U.S. So it's in a way, especially now that the Supreme Court has declared that under this precedent, Citizens United, in that Supreme Court decision, President Obama was so critical of the fact that they had equated spending money with making political speech so that the money is now free-flowing in presidential campaigns. The campaign finance reform is not the same as lobbying. And anyone who's taken Gov 101, anything like Intro to American Government, knows that lobbying is not the same as campaign finance. But whereas campaign finance is where corporations and wealthy individuals try as much as they can to elect friendly people to office, lobbying is where they get to call upon those people, perhaps, or they just try to get people who are already in office to do things for them that are in their interests. And I skipped over the thing about President Obama. He was so critical of them that he openly criticized a Supreme Court opinion during the State of the Union address, which he probably only did because, and they were sitting right in front of him, and some of them were visibly uncomfortable being criticized to their face, while they were also compelled by tradition to be emotionless and seated even during those applause lines that a president always gets, or criticisms the president usually gets during the State of the Union. And he probably felt empowered to do this simply because of the substance of what was being done in the monumental idea of calling money speech, but also because he is by trade not only a politician and an attorney, but actually a constitutional law professor. So he might have felt empowered to do that because he felt he knew a lot about it. And an alternative career path for Barack Obama might have been a seat in the Supreme Court. But that didn't happen, but he felt empowered to criticize them so openly. So anyway, but it was still very unprecedented for a president to openly criticize the Supreme Court in front of them while the entire country is kind of gathered around listening to him speak. So anyway, so as a result of this decision, it's not just wealthy individuals and corporations, of course not, but they are certainly the most visible and well-connected and most effective in lobbying and campaign finance. And they've certainly poured the most resources into lobbying to the point where, every member of Congress who doesn't go back and run for president is inevitably at least offered a job, even if they don't take it as a lobbyist, to be able to quadruple or make 10 times their salary that they did in Congress, if they could just go and try to persuade their old friends to persuade them to act in the interests of the first friends, new employers. So anyway, so that's for another time. But you should also know that in presidential debates, in forming coalitions, all of those things need money. We can talk more about presidential debates if you want, but one thing I want you to keep in mind while you're thinking about how a presidential campaign evolves with all this constant need for money and media attention, not just in the invisible primary, but through the rest of the primary, is how much does their message change? How much does it need to evolve? And by the time they are elected, what kind of mandate do they actually have that's anything like the recognizable campaign they had at the beginning of the campaign, which is usually about 2 years in the past at that point. That's how long it takes. And when we get to the media chapter, I want you to think once more about a question I'm going to bring up now, which is, fundamentally, is it a good idea for a democracy like ours to have such a central political figure elected every 4 years, subject to an election cycle that basically lasts about 2 years out of every 4? And so that's where horse race coverage comes in, and that's where, the money and the media attention comes in, because so much of it is personality driven. How much of that election cycle really does address the policy issues that actually affect most people's lives? Okay, so that's all for me for now. Hopefully you can watch this before class, before you engage in class discussion, and we can talk more about it then. Thanks very much, and thanks for watching.